American presidents. Next, the first of 4 life portraits we'll show you today. We start with President Millard Fillmore, our 14th chief executive. Last June, we were live at the Fillmore House Museum in East Aurora, New York, to examine his presidency. But first, a brief biographical look at his life and times.
On the night of July 9, 1850, Vice President Millard Fillmore received a knock on the door of his Willard Hotel room in Washington, D.C. He was informed of the death of President Zachary Taylor. The following morning at 11 a.m., he entered the House chamber and in front of the gathered members of the House and Senate was quietly sworn in as the 13th President of the United States. Millard Fillmore was born on January 7, 1800, in a log cabin on a farm in Locke Township near Moravia, New York. The second of 9 children, he held odd jobs and taught himself how to read with a Bible and a dictionary. At age 19, he entered school and became the favorite student of 20-year-old Abigail Powers. The two eventually married in 1826, but not before Fillmore became established as a lawyer in East Aurora, New York. A son, Millard Powers, was born in 1828, a year before Fillmore became a New York assemblyman. Daughter Mary arrived in 1832, the same year he was first elected to Congress. Fillmore was elected to 3 more terms in the House and served as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. The 5'10" Fillmore was said to have been well-built, dark-haired, and handsome in his youth. By the time he reached the presidency, however, his hair had turned white and he had gained considerable weight. Although he was said to have been amiable and well-liked in small circles, his slow, deliberate speeches were interpreted as pragmatic and unemotional by larger audiences. His wife, Abigail, was frail by the time her husband assumed the presidency, and their daughter, Mary, often stood in for her as the White House hostess. During her husband's tenure, however, Abigail, a former school teacher, was the first to gain government-appropriated funds for a permanent White House library. She died shortly after becoming ill while attending the inauguration of Franklin Pierce, her husband's successor. The next year, their daughter Mary died at the age of 22. After his time in the White House, Fillmore traveled extensively throughout Europe until 1856, when he was nominated for the presidency by the American Native Party, also referred to as the Know-Nothing Party. He received only 22% of the popular vote, coming in third behind James Buchanan and John Fremont. 2 years later, he married a wealthy widow, Caroline Carmichael McIntosh. Together they bought a mansion in Buffalo, New York, and Fillmore became one of the leading citizens of that city until his death in 1874. During his time in office, Fillmore's critics complained that he lacked the ability to take a stand on issues. During the debate over the Compromise of 1850, he was quoted as saying, "I detest slavery, but it is an existing evil for which we are not responsible, and we must endure it and give it such protection as is guaranteed by the Constitution, till we can get rid of it." Milestones during Fillmore's term included the laying of the cornerstone for the current House chamber, plans for the layout of the mall and south lawn of the White House, and the launching of the expedition to Japan by Commodore Matthew Perry. Throughout his life, Fillmore remained modest. When Oxford University offered to confer an honorary degree, he declined and stated, "I had not the advantage of a classical education, and no man should, in my judgment, accept a degree he cannot read."
Use a Fremont head and tail. He is going home. Fillmore's going home. Old Bucky climbed a hickory tree in a few days. President he wants to be.
These are 4th and 5th grade students, members of the Eggert Road Elementary School's History Club, singing a campaign song from 1856 when Millard Fillmore, our 13th president, made a second bid for the White House on a third-party ticket called the Know Nothing Party. Today, we're visiting the town of East Aurora, New York, just outside Buffalo, and the site of the only remaining Millard Fillmore house, where he lived from 1826 to 1830, before the White House. Today, we'll spend 2.5 hours learning more about one of our country's least known presidents, Millard Fillmore, number 13, who served from 1850 to 1853. Our guests are people who love history, and here's our lineup. We'll be talking with Rachel Francis, who is a teacher and author of a children's book called Will the Real Millard Fillmore Please Stand Up? Also joining us on our set, Robert Scarry, who is a local historian and author of a book on Millard Fillmore. And as the program continues, you'll meet more people who understand the period and the time. Anthony Cohen, who is a historian who learns history through experiential research. He walked 1,000 miles of the Underground Railroad, and he'll be talking to us about the politics of the time, the Compromise of 1850, and the Fugitive Slave Act. And you'll meet Marie Schnurr, who is co-curator of the Fillmore home here in East Aurora. As always, during our American President series, our phone lines will be open. We invite your participation and our conversation. The phone numbers are 202-624-1111 for you in the eastern half of the United States, and 202-624-1115 for people in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Here we are inside the living room of Millard Fillmore's small home early in his career. I'm going to ask Robert Scarry to tell me, you've thought a lot about Millard Fillmore. He always is described as a forgotten president, someone we know so little about. Why is he important to study?
Well, I feel that I go along with maybe the people that maybe we don't know too much about. I feel he was much maligned in history, I think sometimes unfairly. And when I came to Moravia in 1959, I always was interested in the presidents. And I don't know, I got more and more interested in him. And I found that a lot of things that I had thought before, my mind was changed.
Rachel Francis, you're interested enough that you've taught those young people we just heard from to know who Millard Fillmore is. Why?
Well, I began guiding here about 18 years ago as a docent in the Fillmore house. And as I learned the story, I thought this is a story that the public needs to know. Millard Fillmore was a man who rose from nothing, born in a log cabin, and grew up with absolutely nothing, but he made something of himself, mostly because of a love of learning. And I thought that was a great story for American children to learn. And
we'll learn more about this house, but since you served as a docent in it, tell us a little bit about its history.
The history, okay, it was built in 1826 by Millard himself. We think it's the only presidential home built by the president's own hands. He built it for his wife, Abigail, and at that time it was up on Main Street, and it has been moved to this new location in the 1930s, and it served as an artist gallery, an artist studio, I should say. And in the 1970s, it was finally bought by the Historical Society and returned back to Millard Fillmore's time.
If you're one of those folks who will be following in our footsteps to see more of the presidential sites, this is a house that's available for tour. And if you fly into the Buffalo airport, it takes you all of about half an hour at max to get here to the town of East Aurora. And East Aurora, in addition to claiming fame to Millard Fillmore, is also the foundation of the whole arts and crafts movement in the early 1900s of this country. So there's a great deal of local history in the area. And today we're going to focus on that period in the middle 1800s. Some things to know about Millard Fillmore. He was the very first president to be born in the 1800s. What are some other quick facts people should know?
Well, we want to clear up some misconceptions. The first bathtub is a myth. That's not his first claim to fame, but he did have the first library in the White House, thanks to his very educated wife, Abigail, who thought it was scandalous that there was no White House library when she arrived there as the 13th president.
And in fact asked for congressional appropriation.
That's correct.
Began building books. Now, as a teacher, you might comment about Millard Fillmore's apparent love of books.
He grew up in a home where there were 3 things to read: an almanac, occasionally a newspaper from Auburn, and the Bible. And so I think this deprivation really increased his hunger for learning. He also had very little schooling as he grew up. He would go for maybe 3 months a year. He was the firstborn son of a poor farmer, so he had to help his dad. So as he grew up, he became more and more interested in learning, and he found books as the key to that. And he joined one of the first libraries in Moravia, in the Finger Lakes, and was one of the most avid borrower of books. And he and his wife shared this love of learning and of reading and books. And by the time he was in his 30s, he had accumulated a library of about 4,000 books.
We know many of you are historians, perhaps professionally, perhaps amateur historians who know a lot about the presidents, and we really welcome your participation. We'll keep those C-SPAN phone numbers on the screen, and we'll go to calls and mix in your comments. If you have questions, we'll take them, but if you'd like to add to our body of knowledge about the time period and also about Millard Fillmore in particular, we do welcome that. We have a map of this area of New York State, if you have not been here before, so you can see where we are. Buffalo is the major city in the area, and you can see East Aurora is about 30 minutes, about 18 miles as the bird flies away from Buffalo. And Moravia, the town we were just talking about from Fillmore's youth, they're on the map farther in the central part of the state. And Robert Scari, I'm going to ask you, since you know well about Moravia, talk about what it was like at the very early 1800s. What was the economy like? How poor were people generally? About his roots.
Well, most of them were farmers. You got to remember that when he was born in 1800, it was really wilderness in a sense. The Erie Canal wasn't completed until 1825, and it wasn't begun until 1817. And so most of the people were engaged in farming and so on. I mean, it wasn't a thriving area.
And to have no formal education would have been pretty common at the time.
Well, yeah, they had the schools, and like in the case of Fillmore, he worked on a farm in the summer. The only time he went to school was really in the winter months.
We've taken some pictures of his birthplace. What exists of it today?
Today? Mm-hmm. Well, in 1981, there was a split rail fence, which has since been dismantled and so on, a flagpole, and picnic tables, and that's it. And we know that's the site of the cabin. It's on lot number 7 in the township of Locke. It's now Summer Hill. And, of course, the cabin was destroyed along the way. And in 1963 to 65, we made a replica of his cabin, which is in Fillmore Glen State Park.
And why are you hoping to have people see what it was like in the time? What's the goal of all of your efforts?
Well, I just feel that there was so much negative things said about him that, and he's the president. We've only had, what, 42, when you count 41 with Grover Cleveland twice. I mean, here's a person who from humble surroundings that became president of the United States. I wouldn't care if he was the worst president in our history. He isn't, but I'm just saying, if he was, he's still president of the United States. And for people just to make jokes and ignore him, I think is bad.
Here on the screen is the replica of the log cabin.
Yes, and that was done by volunteers. No help through the state or federal government.
Of which you were one.
Yep, and we put it, there was a cabin in the area, and we dismantled that. And then we assembled it in 2 years, and we'd have work sessions on weekends. I had students from my high school American history class working on it.
Let's take our first call about Millard Fillmore. It's from Enid, Oklahoma. Good morning.
Hi, I have a history professor in college who used to have a lot of fun with Millard Fillmore. He called him the Great Dough Face. And on one occasion, he told us that he, the professor, was a member of the Millard Fillmore Society. And he said that they didn't have any bylaws and they didn't elect any officers and they didn't really do anything, but that's the way Millard Fillmore would have wanted it. And I just wonder why he's gotten such a bad rap from historians. And I'll hang up and listen. Thanks.
Thank you. Rachel Francis.
I'd like to answer that. Millard Fillmore was sponsored at the beginning of his political career by a man named Thurlow Weed. And people who have studied 19th century politics know that Thurlow Weed was a backroom president maker. He was the politician who arranged who was going to run for office and when and so forth. At the beginning of Fillmore's career, Thurlow Weed was, as I said, his sponsor and put him forth as a wonderful candidate. And as time went by, Thurlow Weed switched over to William Seward from Auburn, who was on his path to being an abolitionist. And Millard got abandoned by Thurlow Weed. Thurlow Weed eventually became pretty much his enemy. And because Weed was also a newspaper editor, he had the power of the press to say and write whatever he wished about the people he didn't like. It was Thurlow Weed who wrote Millard Fillmore's first biography, sort of as a piece of his own autobiography, and he slammed Millard Fillmore very badly. And I think what a horrible fate to have your biography written by your worst enemy. And this is what happened to Millard Fillmore, and he got a bad rap right off the bat. As far as the dough-face thing, that was a term that was given to the presidents who had, they were from the North, but they had Southern leanings. And I don't think Millard really qualifies with that, because he was a president who was dedicated to maintaining the Union. He wanted to keep the country together. He wanted to be a president of the whole country. And because of that, he was involved with the Compromise of 1850, which is the strongest hallmark of his presidency. So that's why he got such a bad rap. I blame Thurlow Weed.
Well, Thurlow Weed's work continues to this day. There are a number of things, such as the Millard Fillmore Society, that poke fun at our 13th president. One of the things we found is this book for children, which I'm sure you've seen before. This was given to us by Joshua Peet. Now, if you've been watching this series from the very beginning, you'll remember Joshua as the young man who joined us in our very first program from the National Portrait Gallery, who at the tender age of about 7 can name all the presidents forward and backward. He brought this book along, but as you can see, the title of it is Yo, Millard Fillmore and All Those Other Presidents You Don't Know. Well, we hope by the end of this program we'll know more about Millard Fillmore. And let's take our next telephone call, which is from Rochester, New York. Good morning.
Yes, my name is Allison Gamby, and my grandfather and my uncle were both named for Millard Fillmore. And also my father was also named for Teddy R. And our home was from, used to be around Moravia, Auburn, that area.
And did your folks in your family know about Millard Fillmore since they had his name?
Yes, they were very much history-minded family. They very much. My father's birthday, which is November 4th, was always tickled to death on voting on his birthday, because he was voting on his birthday was very much a serious matter to him. So he very much enjoyed voting on his birthday when November 4th happened to be on Election Day.
Thank you. November 4th is Millard Fillmore's birthday. Is that right?
January 7th.
January 7th.
1800. I'd like to add to some of the things that comments that were made. That society, along with some others, they do poke fun at Fillmore, and they get a lot of attention. I mean, this thing said about Fillmore that he was nothing. That's what Harry Truman said. That's why Zachary Taylor picked Fillmore. He was a nothing. He did nothing before the Civil War and all that. I mean, I get upset with that. He had no charisma. All you hear are all these negative things. I'll give you some examples when he's a member of Congress. Okay, if he had no charisma, so on, he went into Congress in 1832. In 8 years, in 1840, he's up for Speaker of the House. He was defeated, finished second to a fellow in Tennessee. He became chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee for 2 years. He was the father of the tariff, which should have bore his name, Tariff of 1842. And then in 1842, can you imagine this? Fillmore had some with a telegraph of Morse. And so he asked Congress for an appropriation of $30,000 to help this inventor. He got it. Can you imagine? Remember, I had this inventor I know, and you try to get an appropriation of money. He got that. He left the Congress because he missed his family and that. Now, to be considered for Speaker of the House, must have had something, you know. And you go on and on. The presidency, Okay, he sent troops into North and South Carolina. After there was a meeting in Nashville in November of 1850, there was threat of secession. The only state that really had that going was South Carolina. South Carolina at the time, when he sent troops into that state, plus strengthening Charleston, the fort there at Charleston, the legislature of South Carolina passed legislation protesting that. The governor, whose name was Seabrook, he writes and wants to know why Fillmore did that. The answer, he felt because there was a governor who asked this, was given by his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster. He's commander-in-chief. He sent troops into New Mexico when Texas threatened to annex it. And it was the same thing that Taylor had done when he was president. He threatened to send troops, and Fillmore did. But it was settled because Texas got $10 million for the boundary question. Now, you know, that shows action.
St. Johnsville, New York is next as we talk about Millard Fillmore. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. I'm not calling to malign Millard Fillmore again, but I remember hearing a few years back that there was some suspicion about Millard Fillmore when Zachary Taylor died in office. And I'd just like to hear your comment. I'll hang up now.
Suspicion of what, sir? Oh, you know the answer.
Sure.
This was brought up in last week's program, the disinterment of Zachary Taylor, to see if there was arsenic. And when I heard about this in the national media, I was highly amused because Millard Fillmore, as a candidate for this evil deed, was just completely uncharacteristic. He was a very gracious, polite, kind man. Everyone spoke highly of him except people who had newspapers of the opposite political persuasion.
Were the rumors even at the time that he might have been?
Oh, not at all.
So this
Not at all.
occurred later on in history.
This was in the 90s. It was the woman who was on your show last week who was writing a book about Zachary Taylor and had suspicions that maybe he didn't just die of cholera morbidus, that maybe someone had been involved in an evil plot. But I think it was proven untrue.
Millard was
Of course,
exonerated.
Along with that, Zachary Taylor, of course, wasn't embalmed. If he had been, arsenic was used in embalming back in those days. So if arsenic had been discovered, well, what would you have said? You know?
Right, and tests proved that it was not the case, as we learned last week.
tests proved it wasn't the case.
South San Francisco, California. Good morning.
Hello.
You're on the air. Welcome.
I'd like to thank C-SPAN for presenting the series. It's been fascinating to watch.
Glad you're watching.
I've got two questions for Mr. Scarry. First, hearing about all these clubs knocking Fillmore, there seems to be a serious reappraisal of his performance by historians. He's been traditionally portrayed as a weak or mediocre individual, a politician of limited ability. Several recent works seem to go against this view, however. A book on vice presidents that put out a chapter on Fillmore written by Dietrich Ulrich states, prolific critics and political enemies of Fillmore's generation labeled him as an ineffective, self-serving politician who lacked insight and political finesse. Modern historians, on the other hand, characterize Fillmore as an energetic and modest individual whose perseverance and self-sacrifice lifted him into the forefront of antebellum politics. I can cite similar works from publications, including Burke's Presidential Families, but would ask Mr. Scarry if he agrees this positive reappraisal of Fillmore seems to be taking place. And second, also to Mr. Scarry, it was generally accepted directions in Fillmore's son's will to were carried out to destroy all family correspondence. A discovery of over 10,000 pieces of Fillmore's correspondence in 1967 indicates Fillmore's son's wishes were not carried out. And Mr. Scarry, are you aware of any full-length biography on Fillmore now in existence or to be published which incorporates information from this line?
All right, thanks for all those questions. We'll dissect them. The first question really is there, in addition to both of you who are working on this, but is there generally among a larger group of historians a more positive reassessment of Fillmore's history going on right now?
Well, I don't know. I know in unpublished manuscript I have in Fillmore dealt with the papers in Oswego. And to me, I felt that I accomplished some things that are not in earlier biographies, because if you were a writer then, you relied on papers that were in Buffalo. And
so you know about the son's papers that he referenced?
Oh, yes. I could never understand that, why his son, he said that that the papers should be destroyed. Well, the executor of the state didn't follow the son's wishes. Now, maybe the son destroyed some before he died, but I just could never understand it, because if you go through his papers, I don't see anything so bad that you'd have to destroy him or something like that.
Rachel Francis,
he never explained why he wanted them.
Could you tell us about his family? We referenced his wife, but talk about a little bit about who she was and about the children, please.
He had 2 children. His firstborn was born in this house in 1828, Millard Powers Fillmore, the one we're referring to. He was a very, very shy young man, and they wrote that when he was a young man, he could not enter a room in which he didn't know everyone. He had to know everyone in the room before he could enter. He grew up to be his father's secretary in the White House. He studied law, went to Harvard, but he never practiced trial by jury. He would never be able to be so brave. His loss of his mother and eventually his sister was devastating to him, and his death notice said that he was just, the soul was ripped out of him when he lost both of them. It was also difficult for him to hear the criticism of his father, and so I perceive him as a very unhappy man all through his life. He was not happy with Millard's second wife, and when Millard died, he asked for the 2 of them to do their best to get along, and it didn't happen. Unhappy man, never married. The daughter was like the complete opposite. Mary Abigail was born in '32 in Buffalo, and she was everything anybody would ever want a daughter to be. She was talented, vivacious, very bright. She could speak 4 languages. She played the harp and the piano. She painted botanical prints. We have examples of all these in the library. And a very engaging and personable young lady. As your opening piece showed, she served as the hostess in the White House often because her mother had what they said was a permanently broken ankle, and so it was very difficult for her to stand in receiving lines for very long. So this young daughter, 20 years old at the time, stood in for her mother in the White House, and people spoke of how well-bred she appeared to be, how comfortable she was with anybody who visited from around the world. She was just wonderful, and it was a heartbreaking loss for Millard and his son, Millard Powers, to lose her at the age of 22.
She died of cholera?
Yes, here in East Aurora. She had come out from her father's home. After her mother died, Abigail, the daughter, took over the running of the household in Buffalo, and Millard wrote with great appreciation about how capably she did that. She was just a wonderful fill-in. And one day in July of 1854, she asked if she could go out to East Aurora and visit her grandparents, Millard's father and stepmother. And so she did. She had her 2 o'clock German lesson, and then she took the stage out here to East Aurora and had a lovely evening with her grandparents, helped them move into the new house that her father had bought for her grandparents, and went to bed around 9 o'clock. And after that, she started to feel ill. And because she didn't want to disturb her grandparents, she did not let them know. And finally, they realized that she was terribly sick. They sent for the doctor. They sent for Millard and Powers, who came quickly out from Buffalo. And by the time they came out here, she was not even able to speak. She was unconscious. And she died the middle of the next day. It was a heartbreaking loss.
Age 22, and the Fillmore family are buried in the Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo, New York, and there's quite a grave marker there you can go visit if you are making a presidential history tour. Let's take a call next. Talmadge, Ohio, good morning.
Yes, I'd like to thank you for doing this series on the American presidents. It's wonderful. First, I have a question and then a comment. My comment is Daniel Webster served as Millard Fillmore's Secretary of State. When serving under Fillmore, he became the first man to serve as this post twice. He had previously served under Harrison, and then, of course, into the Tyler administration when Harrison died. My question is, I'd like for you to talk about Phoebe Millard Fillmore, Fillmore's mother, for which he was named for. Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel Webster, twice Secretary of State.
Yes, that's correct. And second question
Was on Phoebe.
Well, her last name was Millard. Her father's a doctor in Pittsville, Massachusetts. And that's where you get the Millard.
So his first name came from his mother's last
His
name.
mother's
family.
side. I'd like to, by the way, answer the question of that gentleman in California who had called and asked about the vice presidency and sometimes the comments about his ineptness and so on and so forth. It's an interesting story. You know, you had Seward, who Fillmore was comptroller of the state of New York in 1848 when Taylor won. And Fillmore didn't go to Washington right away. He wanted to complete his duties. Meanwhile, Seward went to the city and went on to Baltimore, where he had a litigation settlement. And the idea was he got to meet members of the Taylor family. And so right away, by the time Fillmore reaches Washington, and the shenanigans of both Weed and Seward, they began to undermine Fillmore this way. At that time, you had the spoil system, and that was in effect until you had civil service. And the trouble was, Fillmore, as vice president, people were seeking jobs, and he just couldn't seem to get jobs for them, whereas Weed and Seward were able to do so, and he made some enemies there. Now, Fillmore wasn't stupid. He had friends who would write him on what was going on, including two law partners, Nathan K. Hall and Solomon G. Haven. Okay, and in fact, there's a Civil War historian who called Seward the Iago of the Whig Party. There's a lot more you could say about the whole thing.
We are going to introduce you in a minute to one of the women who works here as co-curator, but before we do, let me tell you about our two guests here on our set. Robert Scarry is, as we talked about, a local historian, but before that he served in the Marine Corps during World War II, then moved on to teach high school for 23 years at Moravia High School here in this part of New York. Born and raised in Waterford, New York, and his education is from Northern Illinois University, BS in physical education and MS in secondary education. He has written, from his research, a 1,000-page manuscript that is a biography of Millard Fillmore. Still looking for a publisher, aren't you?
I've got a publisher interested.
And what's the prognosis?
Well, very good.
And what are your expectations?
If I get it edited by, I'd say maybe at the end of August, a good chance of it maybe in the year 2000.
We'll be looking.
But I'm very happy about it.
I bet after all that work.
Right.
Rachel Francis is also from this area of New York State. Her education is at the King's College and also the University of Buffalo, master's degree in elementary education. Born and raised in southern New Jersey, but has lived for a long time in this part of New York State. In addition to her history work, she is a third-grade teacher at the Eggert Elementary School in Orchard Park and lives here in the town of East Aurora. And tell me about your children's book. Will the real Millard Fillmore please stand up?
I'm a great admirer of Jean Fritz's biographies for children, and I've tried to model it after her style with a lot of humanity, a lot of stories, anecdotes. Mine is more the life and times. Of course, if you're going to write for children, you don't go heavy on the politics. But Millard's life was so important in the telling of the 19th century. He was so involved in all the key issues, in the slavery issues, and things like that. So it's about 20 chapters long. I'm still looking for a publisher. I've been so busy with teaching that I have put it on the back burner for sure, but I'd love to see it published someday.
Let's introduce you to Marie Schnurr, who is joining us in the library of the Millard Fillmore House here in East Aurora, New York, and we'll learn a little bit more about this particular building and the role it played in Millard Fillmore's life. Marie Schnurr, good morning, and thank you for allowing us to bring our cameras inside. Where are you standing right now?
I'm standing and leaning on the rosewood piano, which belonged to the Fillmores and was used in the White House. Abigail played it. Mary Abigail played it. It's a very beautiful piano, and we're very happy to have it. This room was added by Mrs. Price when the house was moved here in 1930. And we're glad she added it because it's a place to keep all this furniture, which is connected very closely with Abigail and Millard Fillmore and his later life. I would like to tell you about one of the most important things that we have in the library, and that is our bookcase, the mahogany bookcase, which housed the first White House permanent library. It was Abigail who was the first librarian in the White House, and she was responsible for there being a permanent library in the White House. When she moved into the White House, she was very upset there wasn't even a dictionary or a Bible, and she was a daughter of a minister, no Bible. And there were no other books, because what a president would do would bring his own books and then take them with him when he left. No permanent library. And she thought there should be a permanent presidential library. So through her husband, she got a small amount of money from Congress, and she bought some books, including, of course, a dictionary and a Bible, and some books that were popular at the time, such as Thackeray's Vanity Fair, Boswell's Life of Johnson, Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. And using this mahogany bookcase, which you see here, she had it moved into one of the rooms in the White House that wasn't used, and that's the start of the permanent library in the White House. Then she also had our beautiful rosewood piano moved up there, and the harp. And she used that room as a place where she would entertain friends. She'd serve tea. She might play the piano. Mary Abigail might play the harp and sing. And that was how she entertained her friends, her close friends.
Marie Schneider, may I ask you about the Millard Fillmore portrait that's right over your shoulder?
Yes. That is one of the last portraits that was probably done of Millard. It was painted by a man by the name of Augustus Rockwell, and it shows Millard Fillmore was a very dignified-looking man. I think he looks like a statesman, with his silvery white hair and his broad shoulders, and he was tall for that generation. He was almost 6 foot tall. And the story is that when he went to London and was interviewed by and was presented to Queen Victoria, she is supposed to have said he's the handsomest man, or maybe the most courtly man that she had ever seen.
Another artifact in the room that, if you would spend a minute on, is over the fireplace. And it is perhaps an engraving, but it's of Henry Clay.
Right. And it's interesting because that was taken at the time that Millard Fillmore was vice president. And seated up in the right-hand side, you can see Millard presiding over the Senate. And that was when Henry Clay was talking to the Senate. They were debating the Compromise of 1850. And at that time, of course, Zachary Taylor was still president, and the bill was finally passed after Millard Fillmore became president, and he did sign the Compromise of 1850, which was a very important document for that time.
Robert Scarry, what was his relationship with Clay?
He wasn't particularly friendly with Clay, as I remember the story. There were times when at one point he was, and at another point he disagreed with him. And of course, at one time, I guess Clay was going to run for president, and Millard wasn't too happy about that.
Commissioner, stay there for just a second. I'll come back to you in a minute. I want to hear also Robert Scarry's thoughts on the relationship between Henry Clay and Millard Fillmore.
Well, in 1844, I mean, Clay ran for the presidency, and Fillmore was running for governor in New York State. They both lost, but they seemed to get along all right. When Fillmore would go to Kentucky, even after Clay had died, he would visit Ashland, his home, his tomb, and so on. Well, you know, in politics, you might occasionally disagree or agree on some subjects, but I think by and large they did. Clay thought highly of Fillmore. He recommended that in 1852 that the Whig Party renominate him for the presidency.
Clay, of course, a man who was burning with ambition to be president of the United States himself, and he watches Millard Fillmore get there.
On the debates, I think this is something that should be brought out. For 3 decades, nothing had happened on the slavery issue. And there was really gridlock, in a way, in Congress. Fillmore, as vice president, sat in and listened to the debates of Calhoun and Clay and Webster. An incident happened one time when the senator from Mississippi, his name is Foote, he was a violent person, fought several duels. He pulled a pistol on Thomas Hart Benton, because Benton had made some remarks about Calhoun. And they wrested the pistol from his hand and locked it in the desk. But this is the kind of things that were going on. I think this is part of the reason why when Fillmore became president, he did sign measures, which, by the way, came one by one. They called the omnibus bill under Clay, when it was one whole bill. You had to vote for it or not. And I think the idea was that Taylor probably would have vetoed it.
It's the Compromise of 1850 that we're talking about, with 5 separate pieces of legislation. Let's return to Marie Schnurr for just a little bit of explanation about how this House is funded. How's it all come together?
How does it all come together? Well, we do charge an admission charge, of course. We have quite a few people who come during the summer to visit the house. We're open from June until October, and it's funded through the East Aurora Historical Society and the other funds that we need. There are fundraising things during the year that help fund it.
No federal or state money?
No federal or state money. We are thinking of applying for some sort of grant, and that is being worked on.
How much does it cost to visit?
And mostly it's funded, as I say, through the, we sell things, we have artifacts that we sell, we do charge admission, and that's the way we keep it going.
What's the admission price? How much does it cost to visit?
I can't hear.
She's lost it. Do you know how much the charge is now?
I think it's $2.
The cost to visit is $2 per person. It's not expensive at all. And then we do have a lot of special tours that come, and then also we have people who will call and ask to do a special tour. And often, now one gentleman gave me a check for $100 because I did just a special tour for himself and his wife. And he came from Louisiana, and he appreciated that it was a day that we weren't open and an unusual time of the day. And so every once in a while we do get some special funds from someone who is much interested in our house.
We hope that we'll bring you a few more visitors. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Last question for you, because we'll be visiting with you again, is your own interest. Why are you interested in Millard Fillmore?
Why am I interested in Millard Fillmore? Well, I've always been interested in history. Although I was a second-grade teacher, I always loved to read about history. And when I moved to East Aurora around 40-some years ago, and I discovered it was the home of Millard Fillmore, I became very much interested in him. And as I travel, I have people who ask me about East Aurora and about Millard Fillmore, and that has kept my interest up because I want other people to know about our town and our home and about Millard Fillmore.
Well, thank you. We will learn more about this house later on in the program, and thank you for allowing us to come visit. Let's return to telephone calls. Columbus, Ohio next. Good morning.
Good morning, ma'am. Samuel F.B. Morris was very anti-Catholic, as was the Know Nothing Party. Was Millard Fillmore himself anti-Catholic? I'll hang up on this for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't believe he was at all anti-Catholic. He had close relationships with people of the Catholic faith. The Know Nothing Party, I think, was a vehicle for him. I think he believed that he may have been the only person to be able to keep the country together in such a perilous time in '56. And it was only after a lot of persuasion from people and supporters that he agreed to run for president under the Know Nothing Party. He never, ever put forth the beliefs that the Know Nothing Party had. I'm sure he shared some concerns for the enormous immigration that was coming in at that time, and he was concerned about manipulation by unscrupulous politicians of the immigrants, and so there was some concern for the immigration, and that was the basis of the American Party. But the anti-Catholic thing, I don't think was a personal conviction of his at all. And it's interesting to look back now from this perspective. It may have been true that he was the only person who could keep the country together at that time. And as we know, when a Republican was elected in 1860, that did cause the immediate cessation of the Union.
And that Republican was?
Abraham
Lincoln. The Know Nothing Party was formerly known as the American Party. Know Nothing was a nickname. What did it come from? How did they get the name Know Nothings?
Well, someone asked. It was a sort of a secret society. Somebody said, you know, what do you stand for? And a person replied, I know nothing. But take Fillmore and Catholicism. The only thing I ever found in any of his papers whereby he would write sort of upset with Catholics would be in 1844 when he and Clay was running for the presidency and Fillmore as governor, and he felt that there was an anti-vote against him, and he sort of singled out in one group the Catholics. But on the other hand, during this time in 1856 when this movement was on, a bishop in Buffalo was very easy on Fillmore for the simple reason that Fillmore in 3 churches contributed bells to the churches. He also, you'll find in his writings, he's very pro-Irish in support of money.
And did I read that he had an audience with the Pope during his European tour?
Yes, he did. Pope Pius IX. Now, going back to that visit too, that comment by Queen Victoria. Now, that's in practically every book you find out. What I tried to do in my writing was I wanted to find out how true some of these statements were. And from the British, you know, you have sort of like a royal secretary. And they take, if you have a dinner with, let's say, the Queen or some kind of affair, there's somebody recording everything. And there's nothing recorded in writing about Queen Victoria saying this. And of course, the answer was, she might have said it, okay? And I think this comment came from years after Fillmore died, maybe about 10 years. Some people in Buffalo reminisced about his life. And a lot of comments came forth. Like he refused a degree in Oxford because he couldn't read Latin. And I wrote Oxford, no record of it, and so on.
So there are a number of myths about Millard Fillmore.
Oh yes, and the same thing on the bathtub. H.L. Mencken wrote an essay in 1917, and it was World War I. It was a very serious time, and so it was a satire, and it was a hoax. It got accepted, and in 1926 he wrote another essay saying it was a hoax. He said you compare it with Washington cutting down the cherry tree. But it was so accepted he couldn't do anything about it. It was just part of the thing.
We'll learn more about the bathtub story. We're going to talk to some students here who are in an annual bathtub race in this part of the country,
Okay.
just to support Millard Fillmore's history.
Okay.
The Know Nothing Party, let's just complete that thought. 1856, and Millard Fillmore was their candidate, but he came in 3rd place. The winner that year was Mr. Buchanan of Pennsylvania. We're talking about President Millard Fillmore, who served from 1850 to 1853, never elected in his own right, came into office after the death of Zachary Taylor. And next call about him is from Everett, Washington. Good morning.
Good morning. Excellent program. I was calling. Mrs. French is charming, and she looks so sweet. Looks like my grandmother. Anyway, Mr. Scary seems to be really aggravated or upset because the President Fillmore is not getting his due, and I sort of agree with him because anybody that can come from a log cabin and become President of the United States, even if he didn't accomplish what people, I don't know what they say, but I do agree with him that that's quite an accomplishment, and I'll hang up and just listen to it. I do enjoy your program. It's a good program.
Thank you very much. Mr. Scary, are you angry about Millard Fillmore's history?
No, in fact, I agree with the caller there and some of his comments there. No, I'm not. Well, you say aggravated. Sometimes it's the negative things that you hear so much. It's just like on a person. You know, if this is all you heard and nothing positive, you know. I'm not trying to say that Fillmore didn't make mistakes and so on and so forth. We all do, but the whole point is that you just seem to hear the negative things. That's why I got interested in it. I've always been for, say, the underdog in a way, you know, even in sports.
We've referenced the Fugitive Slave Act and the Compromise of 1850. In about 25 minutes, you will meet Anthony Cohen, whose expertise is on the history of the period, especially about the slavery issue and the abolitionist movement. Very, very prevalent in this part of the country, and we'll be learning more about that, which was really a framework of much of the politics of Millard Fillmore's history. That's about 25 minutes from now. San Diego is next. Good morning.
Yes, I'm a black caller. And I must tell you that I am somewhat upset. Matter of fact, I am very upset because we as black Americans must endure time after time a large segment of America putting forth men like Fillmore attempting to rehabilitate him. And I'll tell you, every time that we have to endure this, it really sets back race relations, and it really does a lot to tear at the hearts of black Americans. And I must say that Fillmore made a lot more than mistakes. This is a man who's guilty of crimes against humanity. I think that, in a sense, as a black American, I can tell you he was a rather sick man. And I'll tell you why. I mean, here is a man who actually backed the fugitive slave law. He was involved in this, for years. And black America, we're not going to forgive this man. And I was wondering now, why is it that, or how is it that C-SPAN and the gentlemen and the ladies sitting over there can sit here with straight faces and talk about this man who really should not have any monuments? Could you, I'm just really upset about this. Could he answer that? And I'd like to say one final thing when he answers.
Okay, now, I can see her point, but you know, when these measures were signed, the last thing that Fillmore hesitated to sign the Fugitive Slave Act, he asked his Attorney General whether it was constitutional. Fillmore said as president that the Constitution was my guide. Slavery was an evil, but it was part of our system, and so on. And the caller might be surprised that when Lincoln was inaugurated, he said that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, but he was opposed to its extension into the territories, and he supported the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, the trouble with, I think, a lot of this was that you go back to 1793 with Washington, there was a similar law, but it was never enforced. And I think Fillmore, as a constitutionalist, when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, what he did was he wouldn't use military action to enforce it. He'd use marshals. And as a consequence, in Boston, Philadelphia, Syracuse, there were slaves that were incarcerated in a jail somewhat unfairly. In fact, particularly the one in Syracuse called the Jerry affair. And mob stormed the jail and freed the individual, and then they were transported to Canada. But Fillmore knew, too, that when he signed the Fugitive Slave Act, that this is probably his political career. I think he showed a lot of courage. And I would say this, if Civil War had started in 1850 instead of 1861, I think the North would have lost. They barely won when it was fought between 1861 and 65. So, you know, you're talking 1999 with 1850 and a period. There's a lot of, and even today sometimes, there's a lot of emotionalism in what's going on around us instead of fact.
Rachel Francis, your job is to teach the history of this period to very young people, third graders. Can you talk a little bit about how you deal with it?
Well, it's interesting. I agree with the caller to a great extent. My Young Yorkers and I have just completed a year-long project of researching the Underground Railroad, and we just put out a book called Secrets Along the Niagara, based on the research in this area on the Underground Railroad. This was a very active area of the country, as you can imagine, because of our border connection to Canada here. And I think Fillmore signed this because he had spent that time in Congress ruling over the procedures of Congress, listening to all the arguments. He knew exactly how volatile the issue was. He personally was, as we said, abhorrent to slavery and never ever was involved personally with a slave as in that relationship. But he understood that this was something he had to tolerate. It was the only thing the South won out of the Compromise of 1850. Everything else was pro-North. And he realized, like as Mr. Scarry said, that this would be his political death. His wife told him, if you sign this, it will be your political death. He was willing to do that to keep the country together. It wasn't a personal conviction of his at all. He thought his obligation was to preserve the Union.
Paul, are you still there? All right, we'll move on then to Woodridge, New York. Good morning.
Good morning. I had recently read a biography of Dorothea Dix, and in it I was surprised to learn of her friendship with President Fillmore. She was friendly with him when he was vice president, and after his wife's death, the book seems to indicate a romantic involvement through letters, and then a disappointment when it didn't go any further than that. And I just wondered if you could comment further about this friendship and relationship between Dorothea Dix and President Fillmore. Thank you. I'll hang up.
Caller, don't hang up. Are you still there?
Oh, okay.
To explain who Dorothea Dix is, please.
Dorothea Dix was a social reformer of that time, particularly interested in the conditions of the insane, and she was also very much concerned about nursing conditions at that time.
Thank you very much. Robert Scarry, can you enlighten us any more?
Well, Fillmore, she would visit Fillmore at the White House, and they corresponded. He was very much for her endeavor again on the insane, but he couldn't get Congress to pass anything. That was the problem. But they did correspond, and I think it was just a friendly relationship, nothing else. People make a lot of do about things like this. Same thing with some letters with Anna Carroll during his time.
We're going to return, Rachel Francis, to the whole thought of Millard Fillmore and the bathtub in the White House. You've brought along, if you can very briefly, show us the H.L. Mencken column that got this all started.
All right, as Mr. Scarry said, H.L. Mencken wrote this in December 1917, and he wrote later that he was doing this just to throw people off of their involvement with World War I. He wrote an essay entitled A Neglected Anniversary, celebrating the 75th anniversary of the introduction of the bathtub to the United States. He fills it with fascinating details, including this. But it was the example of President Millard Fillmore that, even more than grudging medical approval, gave the bathtub recognition and respectability in the United States. While he was still vice president in March 1850, he visited Cincinnati on a stumping tour and inspected the original Thompson tub. Fillmore was entertained in this house, and according to Chamberlain, his biographer, took a bath in the tub. Experiencing no ill effects, he became an ardent advocate of the new invention, and on succeeding to the presidency at Taylor's death, July 9, 1850, see, Mencken works in all these true details, he instructed his Secretary of War, General Charles M. Conrad, to invite tenders for the construction of a bathtub in the White House. The elder Bennett in the New York Herald charged that Fillmore aspired to buy and install in the White House a porphyry and alabaster bath that had been used by Louis Philippe at Versailles. This is completely unlike Millard Fillmore. He was a very simple but elegant man. Then Mencken remained silent for almost 9 years before he wrote a column named, ironically, Hymn to the Truth. He refers to the above article that he'd written. The article, thrown off as a relief from the patriotic libido of wartime, was in substance a burlesque history of the bathtub. I may confess that when it was done, I fancied it no little. It was artfully devised, and it contained some buffooneries of considerable juiciness. I had confidence that the customers of the Evening Mail would like it. Alas, they liked it only too well. That is to say, they swallowed it as gospel, gravely and horribly. Worse, they began sending clippings of it to friends east, west, north, and south, and so it spread to other papers, and then to the magazines and weeklies of opinion, and then to the scientific press, and finally to the reference books, and you will find it in encyclopedias. To this day, it is in circulation, and as I say, has broken into the reference books and is there embalmed for the instruction and edification of prosperity. It was Mencken's little joke on the gullibility of American readers, and he paid no price for his little lie. Only Millard has.
Millard Fillmore did not bring the first bathtub to the White House, but next you're going to meet by telephone Amanda Lockett, who is a student at Millard Fillmore Elementary School in Moravia, New York, who's going to tell us about how Moravia celebrates Fillmore Days. Who is a student at Millard Fillmore Elementary School in Moravia, New York, who's going to tell us about how Moravia celebrates Fillmore Days. Good morning, Amanda Lockett.
Presidency.
And when do they happen?
They have them the last Friday and Saturday of June.
And what happens during Fillmore Days?
Well, the highlights of Fillmore Days is a bathtub race down the main street of town. We do this because some people say that Millard Fillmore was the first president to have indoor plumbing. People come from all over to race the tubs down the street. Some teams win prizes for the best decorated tub, the fastest tub, and the tub that comes the longest distance.
Have you ever raced a bathtub?
I have not.
Would you like to?
I don't think I would because they swerve a lot and sometimes go into the crowds.
Yeah, I think bathtubs would be hard to maneuver on a street.
Yeah.
What is it like watching it?
Watching it, it's really fun. It's you watch the tubs and when they go into the crowds, they really make a commotion.
Has anyone ever gotten run over by a bathtub?
No.
Well, that's good. Don't want to make this dangerous. Now, you go to Millard Fillmore Elementary School, and your town has Fillmore Days. What do you know about Millard Fillmore? You know anything in particular that you think is interesting? You don't know anything about it? Well, would you like to know something about it? How about posing a question for our guests?
Okay. My question has to do with Millard Fillmore's wife, Abigail Powers. I know she married Millard here in Moravia in that she was a school teacher, but can you tell me anything else about her?
All right, why don't you stay on the telephone and we'll get an answer to see if you have a follow-up question.
Abigail was the daughter of a Baptist minister. She had moved to Moravia with her mother after the minister had died. The mother thought that her money could go farther in the frontier, which was what Moravia was then. And Abigail grew up as the one of two daughters, 5 older brothers. And she was very intellectual. She taught school in the Moravia area. And at the age of 21, she met 19-year-old Millard. And that's another misconception we would like to correct. A lot of books say that she was his teacher, as in the effect of standing in front of a classroom with Millard as one of the students. I don't think that was the case. I think they studied together, and they became co-learners. They were passionate about their study of geography and history and Shakespeare and so forth. And Millard realized that he needed to make something of himself to deserve this wonderful Abigail, because she was of a higher social level than he. So he went off on a quest then to make something of himself, became a lawyer, came over to East Aurora and Buffalo to accomplish that. And then at the age of 26, he finally married his Abigail, who was at that time 28, pretty old for those times. She was probably considered an old maid by that spinster by that time. And then the two of them came here, and she set several records for first ladies. She was the first lady to have come from poverty. She was the first lady to have ever worked for a living. She was the first lady to have ever worked after marriage and after becoming a mother. So she was maybe pretty radical for that time. She was also quite the political advisor for Fillmore. She was very conversant on all the issues and was very helpful to him.
Amanda Lockett, how about any other questions now that you've heard this about her?
No.
When you go back to your 5th grade, how many students are in your 5th grade class, by the way?
18.
And when does school end for you this year?
24th.
The 24th, it's coming up soon. What will you tell the other students in the class that you've learned?
Well, I've learned that she was a lot more than just a school teacher.
Good. Great. Well, thank you for telling us about Fillmore Days. You're going to go watch this year?
Yes.
Thank you for telling us all about it. Fillmore Days are in Moravia, New York, a festival in Moravia, one of the places associated with Millard Fillmore, and the annual bathtub race to celebrate a myth associated with Millard Fillmore. Amanda Lockett, thank you. We'll hang up the phone now, but thank you for being with us and adding to our discussion this morning.
Thank you.
Well, Fillmore Days this year is August 7th. But getting back to the bathtub, the best source for any improvements at all in the White House is the curator of the White House. And because any improvements are done through Congress. And in 1974, which was the beginning of our bathtub races, I have a letter from the curator. And he said you couldn't prove or disprove that because right following Fillmore's Pierce, Franklin Pierce, and improvements were made in the White House, including the bathroom and that, but nothing was specified. And when you look at some of your early presentation on, let's say, Martin Van Buren, when water is pumped from the lower floor by upstairs to a bathtub and so on, I mean, a lot of this was not far-fetched. But Buchanan at Wheatland, when he at that home there in Lancaster, he said that one reason why he had a bathtub, which was zinc-lined in mahogany, was because the bathtub was in the White House. So it's pretty close to that whole period.
We're getting into the period.
But I don't know why we get so excited about that as an accomplishment of Fillmore, rather than some of the other things, you know.
Let's take a telephone call from Washington, D.C. next.
Good morning. I want to tell you how much I'm enjoying the show. This is Al Felsenberg. I've been on the show and very much enjoy what you're doing for the president. I should say also, if we ever run for office, I'm going to ask those young children to sing a campaign jingle for me. I want to get to the relationship between Millard Fillmore and Abraham Lincoln. They were both Whigs. I came across the Lincoln letter in 1856 where he was saying that he, of course, is carrying the newly Republican Party banner for his state, but he couldn't persuade Mrs. Lincoln to get her friends to move away from Fillmore, which made me think there may have been some kind of a relationship when they were both younger politicians. One last thing, and this is not a reflection on the guest you have on today, but it just seems that whenever the race question has come up in the entire series, the presidents before Lincoln, the guest, the historian, has very often tried to rationalize or explain, if not defend, the president in question by citing Mr. Lincoln's notion about slavery being constitutional. Lincoln did call it an evil. I'm not aware that any president before him, with the exception of John Quincy Adams, did that. And he pushed very, very hard where he could. There were alternatives to Mr. Fillmore's leadership, even in the state of New York. You had it in Mr. Seward. You had it in some others. And lastly, a previous caller asked what books are out that talk about the period. The best I know is Henry Mayer's All on Fire, which is not only a biography of William Lloyd Garrison, but a fantastic study of the fugitive slave issue from all sides. He makes the case very, very clear that there were alternatives.
Would you give the name again, please?
Okay, the book is called All on Fire. It's by Henry Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R. It's a biography of William Lloyd Garrison.
Thanks.
But it takes the story from about 1800 all the way to the end of the Civil War.
Thank you. We're going to focus on that period with our next guest, who will be with us in just a few minutes, Anthony Cohen. Let me ask you, sir, just very briefly, define the Whigs for us. Our caller. You still there? We've lost him, so I'm going to ask Mr. Scary, would you define who the Whigs were? What was their major reason for being as a political party?
Well, you know, in some ways they believed in internal improvements and canals and roads. They were sort of like, that was under the American system under Henry Clay. In a sense, they were very progressive, if you want to think of it that way. And some of the things that they later got into in the whole slavery question, you know, probably brought about their demise.
Business and property, I think, were their main emphasis.
Yeah.
But they died, the Whigs died in '52 at the death of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. It's pretty much the end of it.
And again, '52, I feel that Fillmore really deserved to be renominated. And I think if he had, he would have won.
Bellevue, Washington, good morning.
Hi. One of the biggest mistakes an American can make is to not study American history because they are hung up on this whole slavery issue. And the best way to keep it in proper perspective is to read Denise D'Souza's book titled The End of Racism, especially Chapter 3, where he asks the question, was slavery a racist institution? And he gives examples there about how free black males owned other black slaves. And perhaps your author there may want to talk about that a little bit. And that's all I have to say. Goodbye.
Thank you for your call.
Well, you take this whole slavery issue, you know, I don't know, it just seems to me that we just keep going over and over again. In November, well, twice in 1850, there was conventions in Nashville, Tennessee, and there was a threat of secession. The one that was most vocal was South Carolina. The whole thing about it was Fillmore is no slave owner. Among all his early presidents we had, he was no slave owner. Of course, Adams weren't either, but, and he was. And he said, this man said there was no evil. Nobody ever said about it. He called it an evil that had to be tolerated, unfortunately, and so on. And the whole matter here was he was for preservation of the Union. One reason he didn't go in the Republican Party like Seward and others, he believed that the Republican Party believed in sectionalism and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, he got with the American Party. But he predicted a civil war if things went along the way.
And since it was the framework of his entire presidency and the country getting closer and closer to falling apart over this issue, not a surprise that we would spend much of our time talking about it in this period of American history. We're going to meet another one of your students in just a second. Explain to our audience about the Young Yorkers.
The Young Yorkers is a history club. We focus mostly on New York State or local history, and each year I try to take a different emphasis with it. This year it's been a year-long emphasis on the Underground Railroad, and I've tried to teach the children how to be historians. They started by interviewing their elders. They chose grandparents or elderly neighbors to interview. And the first chapter of our book is the result of those interviews. And then we learned as much as we could about the Underground Railroad through reading a number of books for children. We used the internet for research. I took several of them, including Larry, who's about to ask a question, up to the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society to do research. We found there several documents that we purchased for use in our book. And it was very exciting to the children. I think they're real turned on to the whole process of history now. The Young Yorkers is an organization that's statewide. It's sponsored by the New York State Historical Association in Cooperstown. And I really encourage people to get involved because it can be very motivating for the children.
The young man who is about to be on your screen is Larry Sievert, who is part of the Young Yorkers History Club, a student at Eggert Elementary School. And Larry Sievert, what do you like about history?
I just like to know what happened in the past and I guess just what happened.
Is your family encouraging your exploration of history?
Yes.
Are you teaching them things, or is your family already interested in history?
My dad is somehow. Well, I am teaching him a little, sort of.
What can you tell us about the period of time you spent your last year studying on? What's an important fact to know about the Underground Railroad and the Fugitive Slave Act?
That it was not an Underground Railroad. Some kids and adults think that it was a railroad, but it actually wasn't. It was a group of people, some Quakers and some other people, who would actually they would send signs and signals to people saying, you know, that they can go up through and go to their house and then stop and then get to the north.
So no train cars on this railroad. It was, in fact, a pathway to the north. Well, I should tell our audience where you are. You are on the lawn outside the Millard Fillmore home here, and it's just off Main Street in East Aurora, New York. And as you can see, the garden's in full bloom right now. And as you stand there, let me ask you about a question you might have for our guests about Millard Fillmore.
I was wondering, was he a good or a bad student in school?
Why don't we ask your teacher, Rachel Francis, was he a good or bad student?
Well, he was not able to go very often. As we said, he was a farm boy, so he would go in the winter for about 3 months when there was someone who would teach school. Later on, he went to this academy where he ran into Abigail, and he was a passionate learner there. He had a job as a wool carder where he set himself up with a dictionary in the middle of 2 spools he had to change. He would change the spool, read a definition of a word, and then change another spool. So I'm not sure he was such a great employee if he was doing that, but he sure was passionate about learning. And then later on, he was connected with a Quaker judge in Moravia who taught him law. But this was how he taught him law. He handed him a book of law and said, "Thee will turn thy attention to this." And Millard didn't quite know how to sit down with a great big law book and learn it. So he told a group of students late in his life that what he did was copy it word for word. And that was how he that's how he studied law on his own with very little help from Judge Wood.
Larry Sievert, any reaction?
No, you answered my question very good. Thank you.
Thank you for asking it. Let's take a telephone call from Warsaw, New York.
Hi, Susan. I'm just really enjoying your presidential programs. I really wish they were available to grandmothers like me so we could save them for our really preschool young grandchildren, and I just love all of this information. However, I am a Lincoln file, and I have loads of Lincoln books, and one of the threads that runs through when they reversed Lincoln's trip from Springfield to Washington after he had been assassinated, and they brought the body back to all of the major cities. Buffalo was one of the ones that, in deference to Millard Fillmore, apparently, because he was kind of like an arch enemy of Lincoln and really kind of opposed Lincoln all along, Buffalo, New York kind of did not do as much as some of the other cities did, just strictly because of Millard Fillmore. I'll hang up and listen to the comment on that.
Robert Scary, you are emphatically shaking your head no to that.
I disagree. On Lincoln, on his way to his inaugural, he stopped in Buffalo, stayed overnight at Fillmore's place. They went to church, and certainly they must have talked about politics and that. And on the train going back to Springfield, they were stopping at various places. And Fillmore was just in the head of a group of citizens, honorary citizens, to do this. And hear comments about Fillmore disliking Lincoln and that and so on. Now, during the Civil War, there's things were happening in the Civil War where he didn't maybe agree sometimes on the military fulfillment and things like that, and supported, I think it was General McClellan, when he ran for the presidency along the way. But I disagree that he disliked Lincoln and so on. He went on a trip in the Mississippi in the West in 1854. It was put up by a railroad magnate. And on the way back from that, they went on the Mississippi River up to St. Paul and that whole area of Minnesota, which was a territory then. And on the way back, he stopped in Springfield and met with Lincoln. Lincoln then was just a congressman and that, so on.
I was just reading about the train that bore Lincoln back after his assassination, and it stopped in Buffalo, and it was my understanding in the book that I read that Buffalo was working hard to make up for Lincoln's first visit through Buffalo. Someone evidently had taken a saw to a platform on which Lincoln was speaking, and the city of Buffalo was embarrassed over this incident, and they were working very hard in this in the funeral train's visit to make up for that embarrassment. So I don't understand the caller's perception at all.
We will be back with these guests in a few minutes. Before we say goodbye to them, I want to tell you, as you can see, there's something of a theme of classrooms and young people with our Millard Fillmore program this morning. We're hoping that teachers will find our American Presidents series, and especially during the summer months when more teachers are home and have a chance to flip around the dials. We have a full range of C-SPAN in the classroom materials so that you can teach about American presidents, and they are available free of charge if you are a teacher. You can see there are two ways to get the information. One is on the internet at C-SPAN, make sure you have that hyphen in it, .org/classroom, or you can telephone 202-626-4858, 202-626.
American presidents. Next, the first of 4 life portraits we'll show you today. We start with President Millard Fillmore, our 14th chief executive. Last June, we were live at the Fillmore House Museum in East Aurora, New York, to examine his presidency. But first, a brief biographical look at his life and times.
On the night of July 9, 1850, Vice President Millard Fillmore received a knock on the door of his Willard Hotel room in Washington, D.C. He was informed of the death of President Zachary Taylor. The following morning at 11 a.m., he entered the House chamber and in front of the gathered members of the House and Senate was quietly sworn in as the 13th President of the United States. Millard Fillmore was born on January 7, 1800, in a log cabin on a farm in Locke Township near Moravia, New York. The second of 9 children, he held odd jobs and taught himself how to read with a Bible and a dictionary. At age 19, he entered school and became the favorite student of 20-year-old Abigail Powers. The two eventually married in 1826, but not before Fillmore became established as a lawyer in East Aurora, New York. A son, Millard Powers, was born in 1828, a year before Fillmore became a New York assemblyman. Daughter Mary arrived in 1832, the same year he was first elected to Congress. Fillmore was elected to 3 more terms in the House and served as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. The 5'10" Fillmore was said to have been well-built, dark-haired, and handsome in his youth. By the time he reached the presidency, however, his hair had turned white and he had gained considerable weight. Although he was said to have been amiable and well-liked in small circles, his slow, deliberate speeches were interpreted as pragmatic and unemotional by larger audiences. His wife, Abigail, was frail by the time her husband assumed the presidency, and their daughter, Mary, often stood in for her as the White House hostess. During her husband's tenure, however, Abigail, a former school teacher, was the first to gain government-appropriated funds for a permanent White House library. She died shortly after becoming ill while attending the inauguration of Franklin Pierce, her husband's successor. The next year, their daughter Mary died at the age of 22. After his time in the White House, Fillmore traveled extensively throughout Europe until 1856, when he was nominated for the presidency by the American Native Party, also referred to as the Know Nothing Party. He received only 22% of the popular vote, coming in third behind James Buchanan and John Fremont. 2 years later, he married a wealthy widow, Caroline Carmichael McIntosh. Together they bought a mansion in Buffalo, New York, and Fillmore became one of the leading citizens of that city until his death in 1874. During his time in office, Fillmore's critics complained that he lacked the ability to take a stand on issues. During the debate over the Compromise of 1850, he was quoted as saying, "I detest slavery, but it is an existing evil for which we are not responsible, and we must endure it and give it such protection as is guaranteed by the Constitution till we can get rid of it." Milestones during Fillmore's term included the laying of the cornerstone for the current House chamber, plans for the layout of the mall and south lawn of the White House, and the launching of the expedition to Japan by Commodore Matthew Perry. Throughout his life, Fillmore remained modest. When Oxford University offered to confer an honorary degree, he declined and stated, "I had not the advantage of a classical education, and no man should, in my judgment, accept a degree he cannot read."
Few days, mother's told there is a certain pop. He is going home. He'll have the White House yonder. In a few days, he'll have the White House yonder. Fillmore's going home. Fillmore's the man who cannot fail. In a few days, we'll use up Fremont head and tail.
are 4th and 5th grade students, members of the Eggert Road Elementary School's History Club, singing a campaign song from 1856 when Millard Fillmore, our 13th president, made a second bid for the White House on a third-party ticket called the Know Nothing Party. Today, we're visiting the town of East Aurora, New York, just outside Buffalo, and the site of the only remaining Millard Fillmore house, where he lived from 1826 to 1830, before the White House. Today, we'll spend 2.5 hours learning more about one of our country's least known presidents.
Enacted to govern how free blacks and slave-holding people, either resident in those states or traveling through those states, would be dealt with.
We welcome your telephone calls. If you'd like to talk about Millard Fillmore specifically, you are most welcome to do that. If you'd like to talk about the history of this period and about the Fugitive Slave Act and the Compromise of 1850 and join in the conversation, you are most welcome to do that as well. Here are the phone numbers: 202-624-1111 for the eastern half of the United States, 202-624-1115 for those of you living in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Now, Anthony Cohen did some experiential learning about the Underground Railroad, which really got into high gear during this period. We're going to take a couple calls and then learn about your trip and what you learned. Los Angeles, good morning.
Good morning. I resent the fact that many of your guests and callers are attempting to rationalize the Fugitive Slave Act, and particularly Fillmore. And they have suggested, many people have suggested over and over again that it was a necessary evil, for example, and that they were attempting to keep the Union together. I think this is quite tragic. I mean, when we speak of the situation in Germany, for example, with the Holocaust, I suppose a lot of people could say that that was a necessary evil. But if we say that, it's going to really inflame a lot of people of the Jewish faith. And so I think we should be careful when we talk about this issue. Now, Fillmore, there's no escaping the fact that this man defined slavery. He made it illegal for these poor people to escape. And so there was clearly nowhere to turn under his administration. But yet we are praising him. We have monuments to him. And I just think that it's a very tragic situation. And then I see a lot of young children who are beginning to learn about this man. And they're not learning so much about his history of crimes against humanity, but they're learning a lot of things that are quite pleasant. And I think that we're starting all over again. When I see these children, when you ask them, tell me something about Fillmore, they're not saying, well, it's unfortunate that he was a slaveholder. They're thinking of other pleasantries. So I think
caller, the student who just spoke talked about the Underground Railroad. So give us some credit for actually mixing this into the discussion as well.
I will give the student credit. You're correct. The student did indeed mention the Underground Railroad, and so I thought that. But I've seen a lot of the children. I've watched this series, and it appears that a lot of the children know very little about slavery, and they're sort of being desensitized. And so I would suggest that C-SPAN also have a show where they allow Black Americans to discuss the legacy of slavery with respect to these presidents, and it would be fair because we don't have an opportunity here. All we can do is call in. And
okay, thanks.
It's quite frustrating.
Well, I don't know why you're frustrated, because you're calling in and participating and helping all of us learn in a program that's about all of American history. And that's really what we're trying to do, is have all of us learn about the history of our country. So thank you for expressing your point of view. And Anthony Cohen, take it away.
Yes, as a Black American, I can relate to much of the sentiment that the caller expressed. I think there is a kind of sense in our country today that to look back on the past and try and make any sense of it is a dangerous thing to do. Dangerous because the way we live in our culture today, our politics, our social structure, our community values are different from people of the past. and that somehow if we take too careful a look, I believe that we might see some of ourselves in those people. I agree with the caller that I think so often and for so long there have been apologists for slavery. Many people would express to me when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s that, you know, slavery wasn't acceptable at that time, but it was back in the times before Lincoln. And the reason being was those were different people and they had different thoughts. There was great opposition in this country to slavery from its inception. States today that we would most readily connect with the image of slavery, such as South Carolina and Georgia, in the very early years of their developments as colonies, debated and questioned whether slavery would be the direction that they would go. In the mid-1700s, Georgia nearly prohibited slavery within its borders. But during the time of the Revolution through the beginning of the 19th century, there were great changes in the country, economic, population changes, and through various reasons, slavery not only was accepted, but began to thrive. I think when we look back at somebody like Millard Fillmore and the period he was in, we have to realize that no single person was responsible for the fugitive slave law, but that the national legislature, the Congress of the United States, was the one that passed various laws, you know, for nearly 70 years, which allowed slavery to persist. So I think we need to start by looking at it over a continuum and not necessarily picking out the individual elements for blame.
Cleveland, you're next for Anthony Cohen. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I just love the President series. I think that it's really good and educational. I do agree with the previous caller in respect that most of the guests that do appear and the many of the calls are regarding or have a rejoicing type of attitude about the suffering of a race of people. And regarding the different slave type of industries, there were field workers, and there were breeders, and there were whites that profited from human cargo. During the 1850s, there were reports which documented estimates showing that the products from slaves amounted to over $136 million, and that cotton alone amounted to $98,000. And this is just the estimates from 1 year. Through much and many long debates, it seems as if the founding fathers came to the conclusion that they themselves had become accustomed to the status quo. They grappled and they wrestled with themselves, and they realized their own true feelings, that living with Negroes as free people in America was definitely something hard to fathom. And this was the first time that they had probably realized that the institution called slavery had become a way of life which only benefited them. And the years of dehumanization and the abusive treatment of Negroes in America have never been brought to the forefront and questioned. So my question, in essence, is, was it deliberate that no reparations were offered? And if we know that Congress, the same body of people, even though they're the same white people. I mean, it's sad to look at this, and now to find that people are trying to justify reasons why Negroes or African Americans should not receive reparations even in 1999.
Thank you, Cleveland. Let's get a response from Anthony Cohen.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we first have to say that the movement to abolish slavery began as soon as slavery began to entrench itself in this country. I believe in 1745, Massachusetts was the first state to pass laws trying to prohibit the importation of African slaves, and even called for death penalties for piracy and people who did that illegally. Each generation, each new wave of lawmakers either push the move towards abolition forward or back. Fortunately, because of how the North developed industrially, slavery was not, a necessary facet of that. So it died out, but it didn't just simply die out. It had to be extinguished by the people in those regions. And what I think we do is when we look at slavery, we think, okay, Lincoln, drafted the Emancipation Proclamation and it freed slaves, which of course it didn't. And the Civil War was fought and then slavery ended. Yes, slavery as codified by the laws of our country ended, but the conditions of deprivation did not end at that time. And we have still been trying to, as African American people, move forward even today. I think when people talk about reparations, there are a few things that need to be taken into consideration. Reparations, I think, would have been very appropriate for the slaves who gained their freedom after the end of the war. Slaves in our country built roads. They cleared vast amounts of forest, converting them into fertile lands. They built our cities and our transportation systems. They raised their families, the families of presidents and all of our national leaders. And they did this, at least in terms of the national forces that existed without any compensation. At the same time, I think as people who tried to put the slavery past behind them, who worked diligently to see that their following generations would have more than they could have at that time, I find it difficult personally, some 5 generations away from slavery, that people today would believe that they could claim reparations on behalf of their ancestors. I believe the true reparation for slavery is, number one, education, the very thing they were denied, and that the second reparation would be a national museum to honor the history of African American people.
Fullerton, California, you're on the air as our discussion continues about Millard Fillmore's presidency.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you very much for the program. Nobody's touched on the life of Millard Fillmore after the presidency, especially during the Civil War, his public life, any administrative jobs or anything he's held. And thank you, and I'll hang up and listen.
Thank you very much. We touched on it briefly because he made an extensive trip to Europe following the death of his first wife. But how about if we save a little more detail of that for our final segment of the show when we'll have our other 2 guests back. Thank you for the call. Monroe, New York. Go ahead.
Hi. I'm calling to concur with two earlier callers from the West Coast, L.A. and San Diego. We've seen, his cute house up in upstate New York, and we've heard some, like fifth graders talk about bathtub races and, the whole thing. But I'd like to discuss his tenure as the head or the figurehead of the, the end period of the Know Nothing Party, which was discussed in a little bit detail before by Mr. Scary, I think his name was. But he kind of deflected the anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant standing of that party, which I just could not understand. I couldn't fathom. That party was founded as a party to combat, like, Irish immigrants and German immigrants. And I can't understand, even though maybe he might have expressed specific anti-Catholic opinion by himself, his mere leading that party gives credence to it, or gave credence to it, and helped it elect governors, I think in Massachusetts and Delaware. And I don't know. I just think that is a huge mistake he made. A totally tarnished much of his career. Now, my specific question actually deals with the Fugitive Slave Act. I was just saying it was before it was not the present guest, Mr. Cohen, but Mr. Scary. He said he kind of likened it to like a noble act. I always believed it as an ignoble act, one where it was just delaying the inevitable, one that just complicated things more. It was like a third way type movement that it didn't really solve anything, and it just delayed conflict until the end. So I'd like to hear Mr. Cohen's comment on the actual nature of the Slave Act. Was it a noble or ignoble act?
Well, I believe the Fugitive Slave Law was an ignoble act, but I also look at it as a desperate act. There was a feeling among Southerners, and now that I've said that, I want to specifically say slave-holding Southerners. We generally talk in terms of the North and the South, but it was slaveholders who occupied the local, state, and national legislatures. They made all the Southern laws governing slavery, and they held all the wealth in the South. So they should be held responsible and not the Southern people at large. But I think by the time that the 1850 law was put into effect, the die had been cast, in a sense. The law was created from a feeling by the part of slaveholders that the North wasn't honoring its obligations to return fugitive slaves. There was also another feeling that slaves escaping did not seek out freedom in the North on their own, that the Underground Railroad, that the secret lines of egress from the South to the North were all part of a deeply laid and very efficient abolitionist scheme to steal slaves. I think the greatest thing that gets lost in the period is, in understanding that period, is first that the abolitionists of the North in many cases were Southerners. It was the late 1700s when many of the Southern Quaker communities started freeing their slaves. It was the early 1800s when many Southern legislatures started passing laws prohibiting any free discussion on abolition or anything that would question slaveholding. And many of those people went north into free territories such as Ohio and Illinois, places where they could settle, where they could improve the lands in an environment which did not tolerate slaveholding. At the same time, as they left, many slaves followed. And, you know, after a few decades, it was evident that even though they had removed themselves from slavery, that slavery was coming to their doorstep. So the 1850 law was really an attempt to get Northerners to comply with the federal laws that they were not complying with. And not only were they not complying with them, but in many cases they would try to stymie them. Masters going north, trying to reclaim property, were often served with writs of habeas corpus, bringing them and their slaves before judges. In the North, different from the South, a slave could testify on his own behalf in many of these courts, in many cases get a jury trial, and prove his freedom, whether he was by federal law a free person or not. And that was the goal of the fugitive slave law. At the same time, there was little feeling that it would really do good. And as we saw in the 1850s, it was confronted many times.
We have a call next from Tuolumne, California. Good morning.
Yes, ma'am. I was wondering if your guest speaker there could comment a little bit on the ties between the Underground Railroad and the West African country of Liberia. If I recall, there was a group of northern abolitionists purchased Liberia for the reparation, actually the repatriation of the blacks. And this is pretty well in older encyclopedias. This is pretty well spelled out. There was clearly purchased for that repatriation, yet less than 10% of the current population of Liberia are descendants of the old slaves.
Thank you for your call. Well, your question actually gives rise to us to very briefly explain what the Underground Railroad was and what happened to people who participated in it after the Fugitive Slave Act.
Well, the Underground Railroad can be defined as an organized system of escape. It was a series of transportation routes, natural routes of escape, rivers, valleys, mountain ranges, fields and thickets. Slaves hid out in swamps, all in a line running generally to the north. Once they reached a free state, they were taken into communities by benevolent people such as free blacks and Quakers, who would supply them with food and clothing and shelter and direction further north. The Underground Railroad went south into Mexico. Slaves escaped into the Western territories. Those in the Gulf went to Haiti and the British colonies, and some slaves even back to Africa.
Now, Mr. Cohen, you've been researching this for a number of years, and in fact have a book that will be published next year by Hyperion about your experiential learning, going on some of the routes. We have some videotape that we're going to show the audience, and would you tell us about your journey and why it was important to actually retrace the route?
Yes, back in the spring of 1996, I followed a route of the Underground Railroad that I had documented from Sandy Spring, Maryland to Amherstburg, Ontario. And my goal at first was to take the secret system for which not a lot of documentation seems to exist, and to find documentation. And as I was able to look at old diaries and letters and manuscript collections and even interview people today who are in their 90s who as children had met the former abolitionists and runaways who were then in their 90s and got direct oral history, I was able to repiece these routes. And then I decided to walk the routes to see what I would find along the way.
How many miles have you covered?
Well, on the first walk, I think it was about 350 miles by foot. I went by foot, boat, and rail. And I think the total on that journey was about 800 miles to reach Niagara Falls. Most fugitives sought out the transportation systems, boats, wagons, and other conveyances. Trains. Sometimes they followed the tracks, sometimes they stowed away on trains, sometimes rode on the top of trains even to reach the north. Because you wanted to get to your destination as quickly as possible, you utilized that transportation. So I used only the methods that were available to fugitive slaves as I went from place to place.
There's another one of our students from the Eggert Road School who has a question for you. His name is Cullen Ware. He joins us now live from Millard Fillmore's home in East Aurora with a question about the Underground Railroad. Cullen, good morning.
Good morning.
What's your question?
My question is, what are the odds of a runaway slave getting to Canada or the North?
Thank you very much. What were the odds?
The odds were good, depending on which time period they were traveling. In the mid to late 1700s, slaves sometimes did go to what we now call free states, even though those states had slavery. As slavery started to be abolished and those lines of escape were formed, it was very easy to reach a free state. Slaves mainly traveled at night and slept by day so that they could use public roads without being seen. When they got to free states, they established communities, settled in previously existing ones, and lived normal lives. It was really the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 which turned the North into a hunting ground for runaways that provoked many to go to Canada. And by that time, in opposition to the Fugitive Slave Law, more Northerners and Northern communities organized. It wasn't highly efficient organization, but it was a loose networking of people and places who provided different modes of transportation and different assistance.
During our next telephone call, we'll actually show you, we will show you some actual video, rather, of a period of this trip where Anthony Cohen had himself boxed in a box similar to one used by a fugitive slave and put on a railroad car to travel to really get the feel for some of the conditions about some of the escaping slaves. We'll show you that, and we're going to listen to Flagler, Florida. Good morning, caller.
Good morning, dear. Being a historian is a great thing, and I love history so much. But in history, there have been evil men, and there's been evil deeds done. I wish you guys would leave it alone. You got William F. Buckley now trying to say McCarthy was misunderstood. He was really a nice guy, and he was right. You got another guy, I've seen our book notes, writing the book, that J.P. Morgan was a pussycat, a real nice guy. I don't see anybody trying to apologize for Cain for killing Abel. Stop apologizing. In England, I understand they don't even teach history because their history is so atrocious. They're trying to blame the Irish landlords because Talleyrand starved 6 million old Irishmen and children, and somebody comes along and they try to change it. Leave it alone. All you conservatives do this, fella. History is history. Evil deeds have been done, and don't try to apologize for them. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Would you count Millard Fillmore as one of the evil men of American history?
Evil, I think, is relative to where you are as an individual. And again, that's not an apologist statement. I look at some of the most respected people of our day and age and think they're evil incarnate. But I don't put them in public office. At the same time, I think slavery, without question, was evil. And I think it can go unquestioned or without question because we all still suffer from the remnants of slavery today. And it has been abolished for over 130 some odd years. So I think that's evidence enough of the evil which the caller is speaking of. At the same time, I'm 35, and growing up, there was very little discussion in any class room that I ever sat in of slavery. Matter of fact, when I was in 8th grade, our coverage of the Civil War lasted one class period, and so I think today at least we have the ability to learn more and discuss more and have more tools for discussing difficult periods of our time. Fillmore, I think, if I can use a strong word, was a minion of the politics of the time. And that in no way makes him any more responsible or any less responsible for what happened in terms of the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law and its effects. The great thing about the Fugitive Slave Law was it galvanized people who could have taken a kind of a moderate position and had taken a moderate position on slavery, and put them in a situation where they had to make choices. The Fugitive Slave Law successfully allowed Southerners to come into the North to arrest and carry back slaves without due process. It gave them federal force to do this. Any federal commissioner, past or present, could be deputized as a marshal of the federal government. They had the powers to seize slaves without warrant. They could make summary judgments without the slave having the benefit of a trial by jury. And the people of the North, as I said, galvanized. Many rescues were enacted, and it brought the attention of fugitive slaves who a decade previously were quietly carried back to the South and their stories never known.
And in irony, it sounds as though a region of the country which was really pushing the idea of individual states' rights turned to the federal government to enforce an institution that it found favorable.
Absolutely.
Columbia, South Carolina. Good morning.
Good morning. You talked about repatriation. I'm really happy to hear you talk about this subject and the whole subject of slavery, because it's obviously a history that is not taught to this day in school, and it's not taught to very young people. And it's very important that the young people get this full history so that they can strengthen them, so that they're able to deal with the lies and omissions of history today. I'm an illustrator, and I illustrated a book called The Middle Passage. That painful trip, just told through pictures. I wanted young people to see and feel this history. And one of the things that I found out, that when they see it and feel it, many of them, especially the white children, said they did not know this history, and they did not know how bad it was. One of the reasons why you find people are able to apologize for this is because the history is not shown, and people are not cannot put themselves into the situation, put themselves into the shoes of Africans who went through slavery. Everybody knows that no one wants to be a slave. So artists and historians have to write this material and write it for very young people. I think it was Toni Morrison who said, the consequences of slavery only artists can deal with, and it's our job. That is to make you feel it.
Thanks for your call from Columbia, sir. Appreciate it. We have a young person, one of the students with us this morning. And you saw from our picture outside, we have a number of students here and many people watching our production. Next, you'll meet Carolyn Randall, who has also a question on the Underground Railroad. Carolyn, go ahead.
My question is, what other churches were involved with the Underground Railroad besides the Quakers?
Carolyn, before you go, can you tell us and our audience listening anything you learned about the Underground Railroad?
I learned about Harriet Tubman and how many trips she made.
Who was Harriet Tubman?
A very famous black woman that kept going back to the south and north, going down to save the slaves and take them back to the north.
And what grade are you in the Eggert Road Elementary School?
5th.
Thanks for your question. And the question is, Anthony Cohen, how many churches were involved with the Underground Railroad?
Well, quite a few. The Unitarians were involved, Congregationalists were involved, some sections of Methodists were involved, many of the German people, Moravians, Seventh-day Baptists were involved. It's estimated that there were, by 1860, up to 6 million people in this nation who belonged to churches which had abolished slaveholding within its ranks.
And can you tell me a little bit more about whether or not the churches formally encouraged that?
Some did. For instance, the Quakers took the lead just after the Revolutionary War, first to request amongst their members that they grant a policy of gradual emancipation. And by the early 1800s, they had outright abolished slavery.
We have, as you can see as you're watching, invited our two guests who are with us for the first part of our program back to join us for our final 25 minutes. Rachel Francis, who is a teacher in this part of New York State. She teaches students in 3rd grade and also has a 5th and 6th grade history club.
4th and 5th.
4th and 5th, thank you. Called the Young Yorkers, who are learning about the history of this time and specifically did a project on the Underground Railroad this year. And Robert Scarry, who is a long-time, now retired history teacher from Moravia, New York, who is very interested in the life and times of Millard Fillmore and has a 1,000-page manuscript which will be published on Millard Fillmore's life. Our 3 guests will spend our final 25 minutes with us. And we had a question while you were gone about what happened to Millard Fillmore after he left the presidency. Was he continuing to be involved in politics? What was his life like?
Well, he was a great citizen in Buffalo, of getting involved in many of the activities in Buffalo. He's the first president of the founder of the Buffalo Historical Society. He was affiliated with the General Hospital. In fact, today there's a hospital named after him in Buffalo. He was very much involved with the SPCA. It was the second organization in the nation against the cruelty of animals. Most of it was civic organizations, and he was in the forefront of all of that. Anybody who came to Buffalo, like Andrew Johnson, famous individuals of that period, he would probably invariably be one of the members of the Welcome Committee and so on.
And Rachel Francis, what about his second wife?
His second wife was named Caroline. She was a younger woman than he. She had lost her first husband, so she was a widow, and had no children of her own. I think the main attraction, frankly, that Millard felt for her was for her money. She was very wealthy from her first husband, and he also found it difficult after he left the presidency trying to figure out what to do with himself. He didn't think it was right for an ex-president to go back into the practice of law, so it was awkward for him, this issue of money, and Caroline sort of solved that for him. They had a prenuptial agreement under which she would keep all her money, but he would be paid, I think it was $10,000 a year for the management of her money. And it was he who had recommended to Congress that there be a pension for retired presidents for the first time. And he had recommended as a fee for that $12,000 a year. So he made arrangements for himself a little bit under that.
But in fact, was Congress agreeable?
I don't think that happened for quite a while. I'm not sure.
He didn't give any pensions to, I think, even past the days of Harry Truman
But he did.
Presidents.
He spent most of his days in philanthropy. He was the leading citizen of Buffalo. I don't think there's anyone who did more for Buffalo than Millard Fillmore in its founding years. And he spent most of his time in reading and study.
Let's take a call from Morrison, Missouri.
Hello.
You're on the air. Welcome.
Oh, I'm so happy to be on. This is a little outside, but then again, I wanted to tell Mr. Cohen, I am mixed blood, and I have a grandfather who was half black, at least, and I have a grandmother who was half Cherokee Indian, and we were proud of it and raised to be proud of it. I'm now 76. My parents always, told us about our history. We had the most lovely grandparents. And my grandfather was evidently born as a result of the escape that went up the rivers in Indiana, and to a white girl, evidently, and was taken in and raised, and he became one of the outstanding doctors in Indiana.
And your point for telling us your family history is what? What do you want us to draw from this?
I just think we hear from so many people who are hurt and look back with pain. And I look back sort of in glory. I've had a chance to be part of a wonderful family, and one that was upfront about everything, and who did change with our 20th century here. And I'm just so proud.
Thank you for your call. Appreciate it. Anthony Cohen, what's your reaction?
Yeah, I think the caller makes a very interesting point. I think Americans approach slavery from a place of shame and guilt. And I used to think that it was black people approached it from a place of shame and anger, white people from a place of shame and guilt. But I think we're all shamed by slavery. And I found among both races the urge to kind of bury any history that doesn't speak to who and what they are today. I look at history, our history as an American people, as a measure of how far we've come. And you can debate the fugitive slave law and was it right for somebody to pass it, which I don't believe it was, and was this person really for it or against it? But we don't debate the fact that there was a need for a fugitive slave law, that it wasn't simply a north-south dichotomy. Slaves escaping were Southern people, but Southern people without rights. And they were helped out of the South by poor whites, free blacks, the sons and daughters of slaveholders who opposed their parents' positions. And they were helped in the North by benevolent people. And so I think for every issue, you have to look at both faces, both sides of the coin.
Edmond, Oklahoma.
That lady who talked, and I agree, slavery is terrible, and there should have been reparations at the time. But she said Millard Fillmore was a slave owner, but he was not a slave owner. And I think that should be set right. And I had one set of grandparents who lived in Kentucky at the time of the Civil War, great-grandparents. And I'm so proud of my great-grandfather because they were against slavery. But all of the free black men in Hawesville, Kentucky, could come to him and have him check the money that they had received for their work. And he taught them how to about change and about money, and he lost several friends because he told them, those friends, that they were not giving their workers as much as they should. He helped them all he could, and then my grandmother sent several black students through the university. She was a teacher, and she shared what she had with them. there are a lot of people like that, and education is the thing by which we can help everybody the most.
Thanks, Edmond, Oklahoma.
I think the Underground Railroad project that we did was very valuable in the values that it taught the children, in compassion for people that have difficult situations, in cooperation of all the different races, the blacks and whites and the Native Americans who worked together to help the Underground Railroad work, and the courage that it took to stand up and figure out what was the right thing to do, maybe not the legal thing to do, but the right thing to do. I think these are all very valuable lessons for children to receive. So I think the Underground Railroad should receive an elevated position in our educational system because of these values.
One of your students mentioned Harriet Tubman, another person very active during this period of time, and in this part of the country, Sojourner Truth. Who was she?
Sojourner Truth was a New York slave from New Paltz, New York. I believe that she was born in the late 1780s or early 1790s. And she is the prime example of what we miss in our lessons on slavery. She was a slave of a Dutch slave master, and she gained her freedom through New York's emancipation in 1827-28. And unfairly and against the laws of the state, I believe 2 of her children, I may be wrong on the number, but 2 of her children had been sold before the passage of that law. And having been born after the year 1799, they were entitled to their freedom. And she brought suit against the state of New York and won. And the state had to retrieve her children from, I believe it was, Alabama. And I think that story speaks directly to what we miss, and that's the fact that slaves were not ignorant people who were simply brought over from Africa and put into the fields with a hoe in their hand to work. These are people who not only built their country, but agitated within the system of slavery to improve not only their lives, but the lives of all people. And I think that was, and pardon me for using this term, slavery's great gift to America was this fiercely independent people that we believe ourselves to be were also people who had to learn the lessons of humanity. And slavery was that great lesson. And we're still learning it today, I believe.
Grosse Isle, Michigan. Good morning to you.
Yes, good morning. First of all, let me thank you for this excellent series, which is so informative. The reason that I'm calling in, I'm interested in a global context. During the first half of the 19th century, I believe slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1837, and the Tsar of Russia freed the serfs in the 1850s. I'm trying to view this as a world situation, not strictly as an American historical situation. How did the United States fit into the worldwide, global history of the emancipation of slaves and serfs?
Thanks very much. Robert Scar, do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, Fillmore, as I said before, wasn't a slave owner. New York abolished slavery in 1827. He believed in gradual emancipation. There were some who believed in outright emancipation and also compensation of emancipation. That a lot of the slaveholders that say, sure, I've got slaves worth so much, you pay me for it, you know, and I'll free them, all this kind of thing. From a global standpoint, one of the things that bothers me, and I wonder if there's an answer from Anthony here, how does he account for the fact that you take the 19th century and 18th century, no white man, except for the latter part of the 19th century, would venture into the interior of Africa. It's called the Dark Continent. And how does he account for the fact that if it wasn't for black chieftains who with tribal warfare took prisoner their fellow blacks, hold them in custody until a slave trader came along, and then they traded these people to them. They're black brothers. How do you account for that?
I'd like to account for that in two ways. That was definitely the history of how the African trade evolved from, I believe, 1472 when the Portuguese built the first slave castle to process and export slaves from West Africa to the New World. Yes, Africans sold slaves to Europeans of all different stripes, but you use the term brother. And the fact is...
Weren't they black brothers in Africa?
No, they were not black brothers.
I know they had tribal warfare.
Africa was full of myriad nations and ethnicities and religions. And, you know, one tribe going to war with another group were not necessarily going to war with their brothers. It would be like saying, you know, that Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland were brothers and sisters. At the same time, Africa has started acknowledging its part in the slave trade. No one will claim that Africans in any way enticed slave trading merchants over to their shores, but they gladly sold them to slaves when they established themselves there. And now places, countries such as Ghana, are looking at granting reparations to black Americans in the form of dual citizenship because of the slave trade.
That caller's question, and we've got another one waiting, so maybe we can, it's a big question, but his question was really what was happening around the rest of the world with regard to this. Can you, do you have any knowledge of it?
Yes, the period after the Revolutionary War was really where worldwide emancipation really got its foothold. The U.S. Congress in 1807 debated and passed a law which went into effect in 1808, abolishing the African slave trade, meaning you could not legally bring slaves from Africa into America. But of course, by that time, the northern states, slaveholding states, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, were faltering in terms of agriculture, and their great numbers of slaves were then shipped south, and so there was a domestic trade. So when we think about slavery, you know, by the time of the Underground Railroad, people who escaped on the Underground Railroad were second, third, and fourth generation American and not African. Britain took the lead, but many people contributed support from India, from France, all sorts of parts of Europe, to what was going on here in America.
Portland, Oregon, you're on the air.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I was a little bit wondering why, maybe you've had this already because I haven't been up very long and I didn't get the first part, but why didn't Mr. Fillmore not have a vice president, and who was his first wife rather than Carolyn McIntosh?
Thank you very much. Why did he not have a vice president?
Well, they didn't replace them then. I'm not sure when that began, but they didn't replace them at that point. So he served without a vice president. And what was the second question?
Who his first wife was.
Who his first wife was Abigail. Abigail, a wonderful, educated, supportive woman who was very much like Hillary Clinton as far as being his advisor. She was very well informed.
And for that caller, it is for Abigail that Millard Fillmore built this house. They lived in it as a young couple, 1826 to 1830, here in the town of East Aurora, New York. And there you can see a picture from on top the C-SPAN school bus that gives you a sense of where this is. Very much a residential street in this town, a bit of a bedroom community for Buffalo, lots of families living around here, and right on the street with lots of folks, regular houses, is the Millard Fillmore house, which is open for touring, $2 for you to come by to East Aurora and tour it during the nice weather months. Well, we have only about 8 minutes left in our discussion of Millard Fillmore. Let's go to a call from Hickory, North Carolina. Good morning.
Morning. First of all, I'd just like to commend C-SPAN for the series on the presidents. I've watched most of them and really enjoyed them.
Thank you.
The lady who called from Portland, just to answer her question, the 25th Amendment was the one that allowed for vice presidents to be replaced, like if someone ascended to the office. So every president vice president who ascended prior to that served without a vice president until either the next election or a new president came in.
Because there's no constitutional mechanism to replace the vice president. And just so, right, and so just to clarify that, in case we weren't so specific, that he was vice president to Zachary Taylor, who died in office after about 1 year, and Millard Fillmore served out the last 3 years of Zachary Taylor's term and was not elected, although he was interested in receiving the nomination of his party. The Whigs were falling apart at that time.
I think if he had made it known that he was interested in it, it would have happened, and it probably would have extended the life of the Whig Party. He was being very modest and
waiting to be asked?
Waiting to be asked, and he kept himself out of the way. He was trying to do the honorable thing, which is really a definition of Millard Fillmore. He was always trying to do the honorable thing, sometimes to his own detriment. Anyway, he was not asked, and he probably could have won if he had been the Whig candidate then.
Well, the Whig convention was held in Baltimore. All Fillmore had to do was just go over and probably say, I'm really interested, and that would be it. I stayed in Washington, and on the first ballot, they didn't have a majority. First ballot, he led, and, you know, I just feel that was a mistake in the way. It was Daniel Webster that held votes, and then he wouldn't shift to Fillmore. Fillmore showed some disinterest. When he finally decided that he'd be interested, by that time it was too late, and Winfield Scott was in the lead. But I wanted to bring out something that Anthony brought out, that this whole question of slavery, and, you know, it's so emotional in the way we're involved in it. Granted, you know, that we have made mistakes, and we just don't seem to be together on some things. But he was crucified in a way. He was an abolitionist in the South, and he was a pro-slavery person in the North. And all his life, he really, from his youth, he was against this issue. The fugitive slave law was the most hated law in the United States up to Prohibition. You know, all those years. And, you know, it's unfortunate. And then, too, when you look at the Constitution, in the preamble says, in order to form a more perfect union. We're not a perfect nation. Maybe we never will be. But we have tried to work towards some of the mistakes of the past, try to rectify them, and, you know, try to correct things. Maybe we never will. But we're not a perfect nation. But I'll say this much. I'd take this nation over any other.
And I think one of the important things is when we talk about history, we often say mistakes we made. And that is tying us into a greater stream of responsibility. I believe that history doesn't repeat itself. I believe you can't learn the lessons from the past. I believe that every generation has to experience and make decisions on its own. You can reference the past, and so we have to allow our ancestors and what they did to be their responsibility. It's up for us to see how we as a culture have evolved from that point and what we're going to do about it in the present and in the future.
We have only 4 minutes left, and what we're going to do is take our last two callers who are on the line right now and then come back to our group. Tacoma, Washington. Go ahead.
Yes, this is George. I grew up across from Harriet Tubman's home in Auburn, New York, and as a child I learned a lot of history about Harriet Tubman, and I really appreciated the fact that I had that ability to do that. One of the things that I remember greatly was some of the people that lived in the area there who had great-grandparents and so forth that knew Mrs. Tubman personally and spoke about her as a person, and what a wonderful person she was, and how much she helped to establish a lot of the blacks that were freed from the South into the Northern Territories. And also she had mentioned, too, that many times that there were many white families in the area that helped to bring these people north to help get them established along with Mrs. Tubman. And I remember my great-grandfather knew a woman who had helped several black individuals from the South get educations and learn about dealing with money issues and things like that. So
Thanks.
I think that,
well, thank you. I'm going to let you go. Our time is really running out. Appreciate it. And we, as you can see, we visited Harriet Tubman's home and had some photos. I want to leave some time for our guests to answer. Martinsburg, West Virginia, you'll be our last caller. Go ahead, please.
Hello there. I grew up in East Aurora, and I graduated from high school there. And
Did you know about Millard Fillmore?
Pardon?
Did you know about Millard Fillmore
yes,
when you
did.
lived here?
We knew that his law offices about the location where Cadet's clothing store was. But I think one of the things that impressed me most was the fact that about a block east of there were at least one place that had been part of the Underground Railroad. That was more fascinating than the fact that Millard Fillmore had an office there. And one thing that I found out today was kind of neat, that he was the 13th president, and that was my number on my jersey in track and cross country.
Thank you for the call. Appreciate it. Well, to our guests for closing comments, you wanted to mention Harriet Tubman once again.
Yes, this is, I think, what every American should do, and that is to talk to people who have lived through history. Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery in 1849, exactly 150 years ago. And I met 2 weeks ago a woman whose grandfather was a doctor and cared for the elderly people at that home in Auburn, and told the story that, that the man hated black people, and how Harriet would keep coming up with, you know, different illnesses for him to treat until she was able to win him over. So we're still connected to the past with living people, and we should pursue that.
We have 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask each of our guests for final comments, things that people should most remember about Millard Fillmore.
Well, I think the legacy of Fillmore was to postpone the Civil War for 10 years. In that time, the North grew in population, skilled labor, railroads, merchant marine, so on, enabling to win the war eventually. And he opened Japan to trade, and he made Brigham Young the first territorial governor of Utah, and they named the capital Fillmore in the county of Millard.
Rachel Francis.
I think an important lesson is that he came from nothing. He came from a log cabin and became the leader of the free world, and mostly because of his passion for learning, his passion for education, and his desire to do the right thing. That was his lasting lesson from his father. His father would say, "Millard, do the right thing." And I think as he made his choices through his political career that we can find now from 1999 so easy to criticize, I think he still was searching each time to do the right thing for the country.
We have some thank yous, as we always do as we end these programs, because there's a lot of work. There are so many of us from C-SPAN involved here, but also thanks to Marie Schnurr for allowing us to bring our cameras inside the Millard Fillmore home. She's co-curator here. And to the students of the Young Yorkers Club who asked many of the questions and helped us with our song. And our three guests, Anthony Cohen, Robert Scari, and Rachel Francis, all who have helped us understand a little bit more about the life and times of Millard Fillmore, the United States 13th president. He did not get elected in the next election in 1852. That honor went to Franklin Pierce. And on this coming Monday, we will be live from Concord, New Hampshire, for New Hampshire's own Franklin Pierce to learn more about the life of our 14th president. Join us beginning Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Well, we're going to close with music as we began. And Rachel Francis, tell us very briefly about our musicians. You brought them along today.
Bob Swarta is the guitarist, and Keith Wooden is the fiddle. And they're famous East Auroran musicians. We're so happy to have them here.
And we'll listen to music from the 1850s as we say goodbye to Millard Fillmore House in East Aurora, New York.
If you'd like more information on any of the 41 American presidents covered in our series, check our website. Start at cspan.org and click on